I am Stella, 34 years old, and I spent 15 years building an empire just to ensure my family could never touch me again. My older sister destroyed my life when I was 19, and my parents threw me out into a freezing Chicago winter with exactly one canvas bag. They told me I was the strong one and I would be fine. I never looked back. But toxic families do not stay buried forever. They resurface when they run out of other people's money. When my mother tracked me down at an exclusive charity gala, sobbing and begging for $250,000 to save my sister from being thrown out on the street, she expected me to cave to public pressure. What she did not know was why her tears made me want to laugh. Before I tell you exactly how I handled the woman who abandoned me, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic bloodlines to protect your peace. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. The grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel was buzzing with the expensive hum of the Chicago financial elite. I was standing near a towering ice sculpture, nursing a glass of sparkling water. I had just finished delivering the keynote speech for a children's literacy fundraiser. I was entirely in my element, wearing a custom-tailored suit and discussing a potential corporate merger with two banking executives. The piece I had so carefully orchestrated over the last decade and a half was perfect, and then it was shattered. "Stella, Stella, please." The shrill voice cut through the soft jazz playing in the corner. I turned slowly and my glass paused halfway to my lips. Pushing past a bewildered waiter and two security guards was a woman I had not seen in 15 years. Diane, my mother. She looked older, the lines of chronic dissatisfaction etched deeply around her mouth. But she was still draped in the illusion of wealth, wearing a designer dress that looked suspiciously like a previous season knockoff, and a pearl necklace she clung to, like a life preserver. "Excuse me," I murmured to the executives, keeping my face an unreadable mask. "It seems we have a trespasser." Before the security guards could intervene, Diane threw herself at my feet. Literally. Right there on the imported marble floor in front of billionaires and hedge fund managers, she dropped to her knees. "Stella, you have to help her," Diane wailed, grabbing the hem of my suit pants. "Madeline is going to lose everything. They are taking her house. You have millions, Stella. You cannot let your own sister end up on the street. It is only $250,000. It is pocket change to you." The surrounding crowd fell dead silent. A few people pulled out their phones. This was exactly her strategy. The public ambush. The calculated hysterics designed to embarrass me into compliance. My mother believed that my pride and my need to save face in front of my elite peers would force me to write a check just to make her go away. She was operating on outdated software. I was not the scared 19-year-old girl she had thrown away. I did not step back. I did not help her up. I looked down at her, my voice echoing clearly across the silent ballroom. "Get up, Diane. You are ruining a perfectly good suit. How can you be so cold?" she shrieked, squeezing out a few rehearsed tears. "She is your blood. She is a mother. Jamal is threatening to leave her, the bank is foreclosing, and you are just standing there. Where is your humanity?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. "My humanity," I said, my voice razor sharp and carrying to the back of the room, "was left at the front door of your house 15 years ago." Diane flinched, but she tried to play to the audience. "We did the best we could. You were always so difficult, so selfish." I was 19, I cut her off, my tone dropping 10 degrees. "I was 19, working 2 jobs to pay for night school. And your precious Madeline, the golden child, stole my social security number. She racked up $40,000 in credit card debt in my name to fund her designer shoe collection and her trips to Cabo." A collective gasp rippled through the nearest circle of onlookers. Diane went chalk white. She had not expected me to air the dirty laundry. She expected me to hide it behind closed doors like a good, obedient daughter. And when the debt collectors came after me, I continued closing the distance between us until I was looking directly into her panicked eyes. "You did not report her. You did not make her pay it back. You packed my bags. You handed me a single canvas tote, shoved me out the door into a Chicago winter, and told me Madeline is fragile. She has a bright future. You are the strong one, Stella. You will be fine." "Stella, that was in the past," Diane stammered. looking around desperately as the judgment of the Chicago elite bore down on her. You are right. It is in the past. Just like my relationship with you. I gestured to the two security guards who had been hovering uncertainly. Gentlemen, please escort this woman off the premises. She is not on the guest list. You cannot do this, Diane screamed as the guards took her by the elbows. She is going to lose the house, Stella. You have a moral obligation. My only obligation is to my shareholders, I replied smoothly. Have a safe drive back to the suburbs, Diane. I watched them drag her out, her screams fading into the hotel lobby as the heavy doors swung shut. I took a deep breath, smoothed the lapels of my jacket, turned back to the two stunned executives, and smiled. My apologies for the interruption. Now, regarding that portfolio acquisition we were discussing, I did not let the adrenaline shake me. I finished the gala, shook the right hands, and got into the back of my town car at midnight. As the city lights blurred past my window, my phone buzzed. It was an automated alert from my company escrow and debt acquisition division. Earlier that morning, my firm had finalized the purchase of a massive bundle of high-risk defaulted mortgages from a struggling regional bank. We bought them for pennies on the dollar to restructure the debt. I opened the encrypted file on my phone and scrolled through the newly acquired assets. My eyes locked onto line item 42, debtor Madeline and Jamal, property address 4420 Oakwood Drive, default amount $250,000. I stared at the screen, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. Diane had begged me to pay off the bank to save Madeline from losing her home. What Diane did not know was that as of 9 o'clock this morning, I was the bank. I did not just hold Madeline's past, I now legally owned her future, and I was absolutely not in the business of forgiving bad debt. The irony of the situation washed over me like a wave of pure satisfaction. For 15 years, I had worked tirelessly to build an impenetrable fortress of wealth and legal power, completely independent of the people who shared my DNA. I had learned the hard way that blood meant nothing when money was on the line. Now the sister who had casually ruined my credit score to fund her luxury vacations was sitting in a house she could not afford, completely unaware that the eviction notice heading her way would essentially have my signature on it. It was not just karma. It was a perfectly executed financial transaction, and my audit of the golden child was only just beginning. The next morning, the atmosphere in my downtown office was electric. I sat behind my mahogany desk on the 40th floor, the Chicago skyline sprawling out behind me like a conquered kingdom. The revelation from the night before was still simmering in my blood. Madeline defaulting on a $250,000 mortgage was not just a coincidence. It was a symptom of a much larger and darker financial cancer. A prominent orthopedic surgeon, like my brother-in-law, Jamal, did not simply fall into foreclosure by accident. Someone had to be actively steering the ship into the rocks. I picked up my secure phone line and dialed my firm lead forensic accountant. I need a deep dive on a specific debtor, I commanded. Madeline. Cross-reference her with her husband, Jamal. Pull public records, credit histories, uniform commercial code filings, and absolutely everything legal. And run a hard credit check on my old social security number, the one I locked down 15 years ago. I want a full report on my desk by noon. Do not leave a single stone unturned. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my leather chair. My team was the best in the business. If Madeline was hiding money, moving assets, or committing fraud, they would find it. I watched the morning traffic crawl along the streets far below, feeling the familiar predatory calm that always accompanied a major acquisition. Diane and my father Thomas wanted me to write a check to maintain their perfect suburban illusion. They wanted to protect the golden child from the consequences of her own actions. But I was about to rip the facade completely off their lives. My desk intercom buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. Stella. There is a man here demanding to see you. See you, my assistant said, her voice tight with professional anxiety. He says he is your father. He is making quite a scene in the reception area. Thomas. Of course he was here. Diane had failed with her public tears at the gala, so they were sending in the muscle. They always operated from the same tired playbook. Send him in, I said, my voice dangerously smooth. and have security stand by outside the door. Do not intervene unless I press the panic button." The heavy glass door to my office swung open, and Thomas burst inside. He looked like a man who was used to the world bending to his will and was currently furious that the physics of the universe had suddenly changed. He wore a golf shirt and khakis, his face flushed red with high blood pressure and misplaced entitlement. He stormed across the expensive carpet and slammed both of his hands flat on my desk. "Do you have any idea what you did to your mother last night?" He bellowed, his voice echoing off the floor to ceiling windows. "I believe I saved her a dry cleaning bill by not throwing my sparkling water in her face," I replied, not breaking eye contact for a fraction of a second. "State your business, Thomas. You are currently billing at $500 an hour of my time." He sneered, his upper lip curling in disgust. He pulled a thick manila envelope from under his arm and tossed it aggressively onto the center of my desk. "You think you are so smart sitting up here in your glass tower. You think you are untouchable. But you are going to sign that check to save your sister today, or I am going straight to the Wall Street Journal." I raised an eyebrow, picking up the envelope with deliberate slowness. "Oh, is that right? Did you find a typo in my recent Securities and Exchange Commission filings?" "Worse," Thomas growled, a nasty, triumphant glint shining in his eye. "Medical records. From when you were 19, the psychiatric holds, the severe depression diagnosis, the anti-anxiety prescriptions. If your investors and board members find out their precious chief executive officer has a history of severe mental instability, your stock will tank overnight. They will force you out before the market even opens. You sign the check right now, or I leak every single page to the press." I opened the envelope and slid the papers out. Sure enough, there were faded copies of my old therapy intake forms from the free community clinic. The clinic I was forced to use after they threw me on the freezing street. The documents detailed the depression, the panic attacks, the sheer terrifying weight of having my identity stolen by my own sister while my parents looked the other way. I looked at the fragile papers, then looked slowly up at my father. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not beg. Instead, I started to laugh. It started as a low chuckle in the back of my throat and quickly grew into genuine ringing laughter that filled the massive office. "You think this is funny?" Thomas demanded, his face turning an even darker, more dangerous shade of purple. "I think it is absolutely hilarious," I said, casually dropping the supposedly damaging medical records straight into the trash can next to my desk. "Thomas, we are operating in the modern corporate era. Having a therapist is practically a status symbol in boardrooms today. Overcoming past depression makes me a resilient and relatable leader in the eyes of public relations. But more importantly, leaking stolen confidential medical records violates federal privacy laws and multiple Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act regulations. My corporate lawyers would tie you up in civil litigation so fast you would have to sell your own kidneys just to pay the initial legal fees." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as the reality of his total failure registered. He had marched into my headquarters fully expecting to intimidate a vulnerable teenage girl. Instead, he found a woman who held the keys to his entire family destruction. "You owe your sister," Thomas sputtered, his voice losing its booming authority. "Jamal is a prominent orthopedic surgeon. If the hospital administration finds out his home is being foreclosed on, his professional reputation will be severely damaged. Madeline is pregnant, for crying out loud." I paused, letting the silence stretch across the room. I had met Jamal exactly twice before I was excommunicated from the bloodline. He was a brilliant and hardworking man who had fought his way through medical school on academic scholarships. He was decent. He was far too decent for someone like Madeline. "If Jamal is a prominent orthopedic surgeon, bringing in mid-six figures annually," I said slowly, leaning across my desk, "why is their house in foreclosure for a measly $250,000? Thomas looked away, a brief flash of genuine panic flickering in his eyes. "They had some bad investments. Medical school debt from his early years. It is none of your business, Stella. Just write the check and we will leave you alone." "It actually is my business," I said, pulling out a sleek black folder from my top drawer. "Because as of yesterday morning, my firm acquired a massive portfolio of distressed assets from Sterling Regional Bank. including the deed of trust on the property located at 4420 Oakwood Drive. I opened the folder and slid the official foreclosure notice across the polished wood of my desk. Thomas stared at the paper as if it had suddenly burst into flames. "You bought her debt," he whispered. "I bought a bundle of bad financial decisions," I corrected him coldly. "Hers just happened to be the loudest and the most pathetic. Now get out of my office before I have building security arrest you for attempting extortion with stolen medical records." Thomas backed away, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "You are a monster," he finally managed to say. "I am an auditor," I replied, hitting the intercom button to summon the guards. "And I am about to audit your precious golden child into oblivion." After the security guards escorted my father out of the building, I locked my office door. Something was deeply wrong with this picture. A highly successful surgeon does not fall into foreclosure without knowing it unless someone is actively hiding the financial hemorrhage. Madeline was concealing something massive, and I needed the exact numbers. Right on schedule, my encrypted email inbox chimed with a high-priority notification from my forensic accounting team. I opened the message and downloaded the comprehensive financial dossier they had compiled on Madeline and Jamal. The sheer scale of the financial carnage took my breath away. Madeline had not just made a few poor investments. She was operating a full-blown Ponzi scheme inside her own marriage. I scrolled through the first 10 pages of credit reports and bank statements. She had opened 5 secret credit cards entirely in Jamal's name, maxing them out to the absolute limit. The balances totaled over $120,000 in high-interest consumer debt. She had taken out a second mortgage on their suburban house by blatantly forging Jamal's signature on the loan documents, which was exactly what triggered the current default status. But the detail that made my vision go red with pure anger was buried on page 14. Jamal had 2 children from a previous relationship. He had established dedicated college savings accounts for both of them. Madeline had systematically drained those accounts over the past 18 months. $80,000 meant for 2 innocent kids was completely gone, traced through wire transfers to offshore online shopping boutiques and luxury travel agencies. I clenched my jaw and kept scrolling until I reached the final section of the audit. A hard credit check on my old Social Security number. The 9 digits I had locked down with military-grade security freezes 15 years ago, after Madeline nearly ruined my life. The report showed a massive red flag. Madeline had tried to use my Social Security number again exactly 3 months ago to apply for a $50,000 personal loan. The only reason the application failed was because my corporate security protocols instantly blocked the inquiry. She had not changed at all. She was still a parasite looking for a host to drain. Madeline was systematically bleeding a good man, dry stealing from his children and pushing him toward utter financial ruin, all while crying victim to our parents. She had completely isolated Jamal. She must have been managing all the incoming mail, intercepting the bank notices, and gaslighting him into believing they were financially secure. I closed the digital file, feeling a predatory calm wash over me. Diane and Thomas wanted me to write a check to maintain this disgusting illusion. They wanted to protect the golden child from facing the consequences of her own federal felonies. I picked up my phone and dialed the main directory for the hospital where Jamal worked. Orthopedic Surgery Department, Dr. Jamal's office. A cheerful receptionist answered. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice smooth and strictly professional. "This is Stella. I am Dr. Jamal's sister-in-law. I need to schedule an urgent and entirely private meeting with him today. Please tell him it directly concerns his children's college funds and the imminent foreclosure of his primary residence." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "I will put you through to his secure voicemail. Right away, ma'am." The receptionist stammered clearly, shocked by the message. I hung up the phone and looked out at the sprawling city below me. Madeline had relied heavily on the fact that I was cast out and alienated from the family. She gambled on the assumption that I would never speak to Jamal and that her toxic secrets would die in the shadows of our estrangement. But I was not just a shadow anymore. I was the storm, and I was bringing the lightning right to her front door. My office line rang minutes later, displaying an unknown local number. I picked up the receiver, letting the silence hang for a fraction of a second. "Who is this?" A deep voice demanded, tight with exhaustion and rising anger. Jamal, I said, my tone perfectly measured. We have only met twice, but I think you remember me. I am Stella. I have the forensic accounting documents to prove your wife has stolen your future. We need to meet immediately. There was a heavy pause on the line. I could hear the background noise of a busy hospital corridor, the rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors, and the sharp squeak of rubber soles on linoleum floors. Then Jamal exhaled a sharp breath. He agreed to meet me at an upscale coffee shop 3 blocks from his hospital at the end of his surgical shift. I arrived early and secured a private booth in the back corner away from prying eyes. I ordered a black coffee and arranged the forensic audit documents in a neat, perfectly aligned stack. Jamal walked in 20 minutes later, still wearing his blue surgical scrubs under a tailored charcoal overcoat. He looked exhausted. It was the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from performing complex orthopedic surgeries and returning to a house built entirely on lies. Jamal slid into the leather booth across from me. He did not order a drink. He did not offer a polite greeting or engage in meaningless small talk. He glared at me with undisguised contempt. He told me he was only here because I had threatened his children's future, and he wanted to know exactly what kind of extortion scam I was trying to run. Madeline had done her work exceptionally well over the years. She had spent the last decade feeding him a carefully constructed narrative of an estranged sister who was a jealous, unstable addict. He fully believed I was a dangerous liability seeking a quick payout from his hard-earned wealth. I did not react to his anger. Emotional outbursts were for people who lacked leverage. I calmly pushed the black folder across the polished wooden table. I told him I did not need his money because my wealth management firm was currently valued at a figure that would make his head spin. I instructed him to open the folder and look at the numbers. Numbers do not lie, and they certainly do not harbor petty family jealousies. Jamal hesitated, his jaw set tightly, before he finally flipped open the heavy cover. As his eyes scanned the first page, the righteous anger in his expression began to crack. He saw the 5 maxed-out credit cards opened completely in his name. He turned to the next page and saw the second mortgage on his suburban home secured with a signature that was a blatant amateurish forgery. The warm brown color drained entirely from his face as he reached the section detailing the college funds. $80,000 meant for his 2 kids from a previous marriage vanished into offshore accounts, luxury shopping sprees, and high-end resorts. He looked up at me, his hands shaking slightly against the tabletop. He whispered that this had to be a mistake. Madeline handled the daily finances, but she always showed him the monthly bank statements printed out and filed neatly on his desk. I explained that editing a digital bank statement takes about 30 seconds and a basic software program. I told him my firm had just acquired the defaulted mortgage from Horizon Regional Bank. I legally owned his debt right now. I was not there to extort him. I was there to offer him a strategic exit before the entire financial structure collapsed on his medical career and his innocent children. Jamal pulled his own smartphone from his pocket. He logged into his personal banking application, frantically cross-referencing dates from my forensic audit with his own transaction history. He stopped abruptly at a series of recurring, unexplained withdrawals. He looked up, his eyes wide with horror, and asked me who authorized the loan modifications on the house. I reached over and tapped a specific line on the second mortgage documentation. It listed the name of the primary loan officer who approved the fraudulent paperwork, David. Jamal stared at the name, his jaw clenching so tight I thought his teeth might shatter right there in the coffee shop. He told me David was Madeline's personal trainer. At least that was who she claimed he was when she started disappearing for 3 hours every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, supposedly hitting the gym. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The woman he loved had not just stolen his money and jeopardized his children's educational future. She was actively sleeping with the man helping her forge the financial documents to facilitate the theft. The betrayal was absolute and utterly humiliating. Jamal closed his eyes, taking a long, ragged breath that shook his broad. I spent the following 24 hours ensuring my legal armor was impenetrable. I met with my corporate attorneys to verify the exact chain of title on the foreclosed mortgage my firm had recently purchased. I wanted 0 legal loopholes. My team drafted the necessary statutory notices. Meanwhile, Jamal executed his own silent protocol. He discreetly moved his children to his sister's house across town, ensuring they were completely shielded from the impending fallout. He froze his remaining legitimate bank accounts and redirected his hospital direct deposits to a new secure institution. Madeline remained entirely oblivious, busy spending money she no longer had while believing her perfect suburban illusion was still intact. On Thursday evening, I pulled my sleek black sedan into the winding driveway of my parents' suburban estate. The house looked exactly the same as it had 15 years ago. Perfectly manicured lawns, pristine white columns, and glowing porch lights, projecting an image of absolute domestic success. It was a beautiful hollow shell masking the financial rot inside. I stepped out of the car wearing a tailored emerald green power suit. Tucked securely inside my breast pocket was a micro-recording device already actively capturing audio. In my leather briefcase, I carried the certified forensic audit and the original foreclosure deed. I walked up the brick steps and rang the doorbell. Diane answered the door wearing a forced smile that did not quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. She threw her arms open, attempting to pull me into a performative motherly embrace. I stepped neatly to the side, allowing her arms to grasp empty air. I told her we could skip the theatrical hugs and get straight to the dinner she was so desperate to host. Diane lowered her arms, her smile tightening into a thin, furious line. She ushered me into the formal dining room. The table was set with their best china and crystal glasses. Thomas stood near the head of the table holding a glass of expensive scotch. He greeted me with a booming, artificially jovial voice, acting as if he had not threatened to blackmail me in my office just 2 days prior. Sitting across from him was Madeline. She wore a loose-fitting maternity dress clearly designed to emphasize a physical vulnerability. She looked at me with a mixture of smug entitlement and practiced victimhood. She offered a weak hello, claiming she was exhausted from the extreme stress of her high-risk pregnancy. I took my seat at the opposite end of the table, placing my heavy leather briefcase on the empty chair beside me. We did not eat. The roasted chicken and seasonal vegetables sat untouched in the center of the table. The illusion of a happy family dinner dropped within 5 minutes. Thomas cleared his throat and set his scotch glass down heavily. He announced that they had invited a special guest to join us for dessert. Right on cue, the door to the adjacent study opened. A man in a cheap off-the-rack suit walked into the dining room carrying a thick stack of legal documents. Thomas introduced him as a trusted family friend and legal advisor. The lawyer took a seat next to Madeline, spreading his papers across the fine linen tablecloth. He looked at me with the arrogant confidence of a man who severely underestimated his opponent. Diane folded her hands on the table, leaning forward. She used her softest, most manipulative tone. She told me that family always looks out for each other. She claimed Madeline was facing a temporary financial hurdle because Jamal was being financially irresponsible and controlling. She said Madeline needed immediate stability for the new baby. Thomas took over the pitch. He stated that since I had no husband and no children, my wealth was essentially sitting idle. He told me it was my primary duty to protect the family legacy and support my sister. The shady lawyer then pushed a stapled contract across the table toward me. He handed me a silver pen and instructed me to sign at the bottom. I did not touch the pen. I picked up the contract and read the first page with cold precision. It was a brilliantly toxic piece of legal fiction. They were not just asking for a one-time bailout of $250,000 to save the house. The document was structured as an irrevocable deed of gift, demanding an ongoing transfer of equity from my wealth management firm directly into a blind trust. A trust controlled entirely by Thomas. They wanted to steal my company from the inside out, using Madeline's financial incompetence as the Trojan horse to hijack my life work. I looked at the lawyer and asked him exactly where he obtained his law degree. I pointed out 3 distinct clauses in his contract that blatantly violated state corporate statutes. I calmly explained that attempting to coerce a chief executive officer into transferring corporate equity without board approval constitutes criminal corporate sabotage. I informed him that his poorly drafted contract was a textbook example of extortion. The lawyer opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off instantly. I told him his contract was not worth the paper it was printed on and advised him to leave the premises immediately before I reported him to the State Bar Association for facilitating financial fraud. He looked at Thomas, his arrogant demeanor shattering into pure panic. He quickly packed his briefcase and practically sprinted out the front door, leaving the family completely exposed. Thomas slammed his fist on the table, rattling the crystal glasses. He demanded I show some respect to my elders and sign the paperwork, regardless of the legal technicalities. Madeline chimed in, her voice dripping with fake tears. She cried that I was being heartless and selfish. She rubbed her stomach dramatically, claiming the stress I was causing was putting her unborn baby at risk. She sobbed that Jamal had abandoned her and I was her only hope for survival. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. I told Madeline she could drop the desperate mother routine right now. I slid a private investigator report across the table directly in front of her. I told her I knew the pregnancy was a complete sham, and the ultrasound photos she had been showing everyone were downloaded straight from a stock image website. I watched the fake tears instantly dry up as the reality of her exposure set in. Shoulders. When he opened his eyes again, the compassionate healer was gone. In his place was a man ready to burn his false life to the ground and salt the earth behind it. He asked me what the exact next step was. I smiled, picking up my coffee cup. I told him we were going to orchestrate a financial and legal demolition, so precise that Madeline would not even realize the building was coming down until the ceiling hit her. We were going to let my parents think they had won their little manipulation game. We were going to let Madeline play her pathetic victim card one last time. And then we were going to drop the hammer with the full weight of federal law behind it. Jamal leaned forward, his hostility completely replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. He agreed to provide me with full access to any remaining accounts, to freeze the assets, and to quietly secure a ruthless divorce attorney. I promised him that my legal team would safeguard his medical license and protect his personal assets from the incoming blast radius. As we finalized the logistics of our trap, my phone buzzed with an incoming text message. It was from Diane. The message was dripping with a sickeningly sweet tone she only used when she was setting a trap. She invited me to a reconciliation dinner at their house tomorrow night, claiming she wanted to heal our family wounds and bring us all back together. I showed the screen to Jamal. We both knew exactly what this was. They were panicking about the gala confrontation and wanted to strong-arm me in private. I typed out a quick reply accepting the invitation. I told Jamal to gather his personal documents, pack a bag for his kids, and prepare for the worst dinner party of their miserable lives. The board was set, the pieces were moving, and the golden child was about to be audited into oblivion. Madeline stared at the investigator report as if it were a venomous snake. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. She tried to stammer a denial, but the words withered in her throat. Diane gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Thomas looked from the report to Madeline, confusion warring with anger on his face. The golden child illusion was fracturing right before their eyes. I stood up slowly, picking up my briefcase. My voice was calm, devoid of any emotional inflection. I told them this dinner was over. I explained that attempting to force me to sign over my corporate equity based on a fabricated pregnancy and a fraudulent contract was the final nail in their coffin. I told them they had severely miscalculated my intelligence and my resources. I walked toward the dining room exit, ready to leave them to wallow in the toxic mess they had created. Thomas moved faster than I anticipated. He lunged across the room, blocking the doorway with his large frame. His face was a mask of furious desperation. He shouted that I wasn't leaving until we came to an understanding. He threatened to call the police and claim I had attacked them, that I was having a psychotic episode and needed to be institutionalized. He was trying to trap me, reverting to the same manipulative tactics he had used when I was a teenager. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I looked at my watch and smiled. A cold, predatory smile that made Thomas hesitate for a fraction of a second. I told him he was right about one thing. The police were definitely going to be involved tonight. I informed him that my +1 had finally arrived. Right on cue, the heavy oak front door swung open with a loud, authoritative crash. It wasn't the local police. It was Jamal, his face a portrait of cold, controlled fury, and he was not alone. Flanking Jamal were three men wearing dark windbreakers with the letters IRS emblazoned across the back in bold yellow letters. Federal agents from the Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division. They stepped into the foyer, their presence instantly suffocating the arrogant entitlement that had previously filled the house. Thomas stumbled backward, his face turning an unhealthy shade of gray. Diane let out a sharp, terrified shriek, clutching her pearl necklace as if it could protect her from federal scrutiny. Madeline remained frozen in her chair at the dining table, her eyes wide with absolute horror as she stared at her husband and the federal agents. Jamal walked directly into the dining room, bypassing Thomas and Diane entirely. He stopped in front of Madeline and dropped a thick, professionally bound legal document onto the table right next to her untouched dinner plate. He announced, his voice echoing with absolute finality, that those were the divorce papers. He stated he had already secured a temporary emergency restraining order, granting him full sole custody of his children. I informed her she had exactly zero right to contact him or his children ever again. One of the IRS agents stepped forward, flashing a gold badge. He announced they were executing a federal search warrant regarding multiple counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. He instructed Thomas and Diane to step away from all electronic devices and file cabinets immediately. The agents began securing the perimeter, their professional efficiency highlighting the absolute collapse of the parents' carefully constructed suburban facade. Jamal turned to Thomas and Diane, his expression hardening. He revealed the final devastating piece of the puzzle that my forensic audit had uncovered. He told them he knew everything. He knew Madeline hadn't just been stealing his money to fund her own luxury lifestyle. She had been systematically funneling his income into their hidden offshore bank accounts. He exposed the truth that they had been secretly bankrupt for years, maintaining their country club image by bleeding him dry through their golden child daughter. The entire perfect family image shattered completely. The polite, affluent veneer they had worn for decades dissolved, revealing the desperate, greedy reality underneath. Cornered by federal agents and undeniable proof of their crimes, they instantly turned on each other like starved animals. Madeline shrieked, pointing an accusing finger at her parents. She screamed that they had forced her to do it, that they had manipulated her into stealing from Jamal to maintain their lifestyle. She cried that she was just following their instructions, desperately trying to play the victim one last time. Thomas roared back, his face purple with rage. He viciously threw Diane under the bus, claiming she was the mastermind behind the offshore accounts and the fraudulent tax returns. He shouted that he knew nothing about the extent of the theft, attempting to save himself at the expense of his wife. Diane sobbed hysterically, denying everything and blaming Madeline's reckless spending habits. I watched the chaotic self-destruction from the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. I felt a profound sense of cold satisfaction. The family that had thrown me out into the freezing street 15 years ago was now tearing themselves apart in their own living room. I was completely untouched by the toxic mess I had finally exposed. I walked slowly back to the dining table, the chaos momentarily pausing as I approached. I reached into my briefcase one last time and pulled out a single crisp legal document. I dropped the official foreclosure notice onto the table right on top of the shredded extortion contract and the divorce papers. I looked at Thomas, Diane, and Madeline, my voice ringing clear and authoritative over their bickering. I coldly informed them that as the legal owner of their debt combined with the IRS asset freeze currently being executed, they had exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises. The bank owned the house now, and I owned the bank. I looked directly into my mother's terrified eyes and delivered the final crushing blow. I told them to pack a single bag. I echoed the exact cruel words they had used when they threw me out at 19. "You're the strong ones, you'll be fine." I turned and walked out the front door, leaving them to the federal agents and their own inevitable ruin. Jamal did not speak for a long time. The ambient noise of the upscale coffee shop seemed to fade into a dull hum as he stared at the financial documents spread across the polished wooden table. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the highlighted columns. He was a surgeon used to high-pressure environments and split-second decisions, but nothing could have prepared him for the surgical precision with which his own wife had dismantled his life. He picked up the copy of the second mortgage agreement. The paper trembled slightly in his large hands. He traced the ink of the signature line with his index finger. It was supposed to be his signature, but it was a clumsy imitation. I could see the exact moment the cognitive dissonance broke. For 10 years, Madeline had convinced him that she was the perfect supportive spouse, managing their domestic life, so he could focus on his demanding medical career. She had painted me as the unstable estranged sister who could not be trusted. Now the undeniable proof of her ultimate betrayal was staring him right in the face. He swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing. He whispered that he had trusted her with everything. He said he worked 80-hour weeks at the hospital, performing back-to-back joint replacements so she could have the comfortable life she always wanted. I remained perfectly still, observing his realization. I told him that predators do not care how hard you work. They only care about how much they can extract before the host dies. Jamal turned the page and the blood completely drained from his face. He had reached the section detailing the offshore transfers and the drained college savings accounts. These were accounts he had set up for his 2 children from his previous relationship. $80,000 of hard-earned money meant for tuition and textbooks wiped out and funneled into designer boutiques and high-end resorts. The silence that stretched between us grew thick and suffocating. When he finally looked up at me, the hostility that had clouded his vision since he walked into the cafe was completely gone. In its place was a profound shock rapidly hardening into pure, unadulterated rage. His dark eyes were wide, but the pupils were completely dilated. He asked me how long this had been going on. He asked how a person could look their husband in the eye every single night, knowing they had stolen from his children. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. I kept my voice incredibly calm and measured. I explained that she could do it because she felt entirely entitled to his success. I told him my parents raised her to believe that other people existed solely to subsidize her happiness. I explained that she isolated him from anyone who might tell him the truth, specifically ensuring that I was painted as a monster, so he would never reach out to me. He rubbed a hand aggressively over his face, trying to process the magnitude of the deception. He said he was going to lose his medical license. He said the bankruptcy and the fraud investigations would trigger hospital board reviews and ruin his professional standing. He sounded like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, watching the ground crumble beneath his feet. I reached out and placed my hand flat on the remaining stack of papers. I told him he was not going to lose anything if he listened to me right now. I explained the reality of the situation. I informed him that my wealth management firm had just acquired a massive bundle of distressed assets from Horizon Regional Bank. I told him that I did not just have access to his financial records, I legally owned the debt. I held the deed to the foreclosed mortgage. Jamal stared at me, his mind struggling to catch up to the corporate reality. He asked what that meant for him. "It means I am the bank," I replied smoothly. "It means I control the timeline of the foreclosure and the collection of the debt. Madeline thinks she is dealing with a faceless corporate entity that she can dodge and manipulate with fake tears. She has no idea she is dealing with me." I told him I was offering him a strategic way out. I laid out the terms of our unlikely alliance. I promised him that my corporate legal team would build a firewall around his medical license and his personal assets. We would prove that he was a victim of severe financial fraud and identity theft. I would ensure his children were completely shielded from the fallout. But in exchange, he had to follow my exact instructions. He could not go home and scream at Madeline. He could not confront my parents yet. He had to walk back into that house tonight and pretend everything was perfectly normal. Jamal leaned back in the leather booth, absorbing the battle plan. The shock was subsiding, leaving behind a cold, calculating determination that I deeply respected. He was a brilliant man, and he was adapting to the new reality with ruthless efficiency. He asked me what the ultimate goal was. I smiled a sharp, dangerous smile. I told him the goal was total, absolute destruction of the Golden Child facade. We were going to let Madeline and my parents gather in their perfect suburban house thinking they had won. We were going to let them play their manipulative games right up until the final second. And then we were going to drop the hammer with the full weight of federal law behind it. Jamal reached across the table and extended his hand. He did not hesitate. He told me he was in. He said he would burn his own house to the ground if it meant ensuring Madeline faced the absolute maximum penalty for what she had done to his kids. I shook his hand, sealing the alliance. The grip was firm and resolute. Two people who had been targeted and abused by the exact same toxic family structure were now joining forces. I told him to gather his essential documents discreetly. I told him to arrange for his children to stay at his sister's house for the rest of the week under the guise of a fun sleepover. I instructed him to freeze any remaining legitimate bank accounts that Madeline did not have her claws in and to redirect his hospital direct deposits immediately to a secure institution. We spent the next hour finalizing the logistics of our trap. We mapped out every possible reaction Madeline might have and countered it with a legal contingency. By the time we walked out of the coffee shop, the sun had set, casting long shadows across the Chicago pavement. Jamal walked toward his car, his posture completely transformed. He was no longer the exhausted, manipulated husband. He was a man going to war. I got into my sedan and locked the doors. My phone screen lit up with the calendar notification for the upcoming week. The board was perfectly set. The financial traps were primed. Madeline and my parents were living on borrowed time, completely oblivious to the fact that the sister they threw away and the husband they exploited had just become the architects of their ruin. The next morning, Jamal called me before the sun even crested the Chicago skyline. His voice was no longer just angry. It possessed a chilling surgical precision. He told me he had stayed up all night carefully cross-referencing the forensic audit with his own personal records and calendar applications. He had found something else, something that elevated Madeline's betrayal from mere financial exploitation to a profound, sickening personal violation. I invited him straight up to my office. When he arrived, he threw a thick stack of printed calendar pages and heavily highlighted credit card statements onto my desk. He pointed to a charge that my forensic team had initially flagged as a high-end gym membership. $300 a month paid to an exclusive boutique fitness club located across town. Madeline had told him she was working with a specialized personal trainer named David to safely manage her physical health. She claimed she needed 3-hour sessions every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. Jamal slammed his finger against the paper. He told me to look at the location data from her phone, which he still paid the family plan bill for. The location coordinates did not point to a boutique fitness club. They pointed to a luxury high-rise condominium building downtown. The exact same building where the primary loan officer from Horizon Regional Bank resided. The man who had personally approved the fraudulent second mortgage using the blatantly forged signatures. His name was David. The reality of the situation was grotesque. Madeline was not just sleeping with another man. She was actively carrying on a long-term affair with the exact financial accomplice she needed to steal Jamal's wealth. She was paying for the hotel rooms and the expensive dinners, using the credit cards she had fraudulently opened in Jamal's name. She was literally using her husband's money to finance the affair, with the man helping her steal his children's college funds. I watched Jamal process the sheer scale of the humiliation. A proud, brilliant surgeon who spent his days repairing shattered bones had just realized his entire domestic life was a meticulously constructed lie. He did not yell. He did not throw things. He stood by my floor-to-ceiling window looking out at the city below, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. The absolute stillness of his posture was far more dangerous than any screaming match. He turned to me and clearly stated that he absolutely wanted to leave her with nothing. No dignity, no assets, no future. I told him that was exactly what we were going to do. I instructed my legal team to dig deeper into David, the loan officer. If he was willing to facilitate a fraudulent mortgage for a married woman he was sleeping with, he was likely committing other banking violations. We were going to hand him over to the federal authorities on a silver platter. I told Jamal that we now had the ultimate leverage. We possessed undeniable proof of massive financial fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, and adultery. Jamal asked how we should spring the trap. I told him we were going to use my parents' predictable vanity against them. I pulled up my email and showed Jamal the message I had received late last night. Diane had invited me to a reconciliation dinner at their suburban estate. She claimed she wanted to heal the rift and bring the family back together. We both already knew it was a blatant trap. They were panicking about the public scene I had caused at the charity gala and wanted to strong-arm me in private to pay off the foreclosure. I told Jamal I was going to accept the invitation. I was going to walk right into their ambush wearing a wire and carrying the entire forensic portfolio. Jamal's role was to play the oblivious husband for just a few more hours. He needed to pack a bag for his kids, drop them off at his sister's house, and wait for my signal. I promised him that when the time was right, he would make an entrance they would never forget. We spent the next 2 hours mapping out every single detail of the upcoming confrontation. We anticipated Thomas trying to use intimidation tactics. We anticipated Diane deploying her fake tears. We knew Madeline would play the ultimate victim card the moment she felt cornered. We countered every predictable move with a devastating legal reality. My corporate attorneys had already drafted the necessary paperwork to freeze the remaining assets, and Jamal had quietly retained the most ruthless divorce lawyer in Chicago. The financial firewall was officially up. I made sure every account with his name on it was legally locked down, preventing Madeline from withdrawing another cent. I even had my security team prepare a detailed dossier on David, ensuring his banking career would be permanently terminated the second our evidence hit the federal investigator desks. Jamal finally gathered his papers and placed them back into his briefcase. He looked at me with a newfound respect. He told me he had spent years listening to Madeline describe me as a selfish, bitter monster who abandoned them all. He said he now realized I was the only person in the entire bloodline who actually understood the concepts of loyalty, accountability, and truth. I extended my hand to him. I told him we were not family by blood, but we were family by survival. We shook hands one last time, solidifying a pact of total destruction. I watched him walk out of my glass-walled office and step into the elevator, knowing that the inevitable countdown to their complete and utter ruin had finally officially begun. The golden child had played her final hand, and she was about to face the house. And the house always wins. Today was the very exact day that I completely burned down the pathetic suburban facade they spent 15 years building right over my bones. My personal cell phone illuminated with a number I had not saved but could never forget. I let it ring 4 times before answering, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. Diane did not even pause for a standard greeting. She launched straight into a theatrical performance that deserved an Academy Award for sheer delusion. Her voice dripped with a sickeningly sweet tone she had not directed at me since I was a small child. She said the years of estrangement had been a terrible misunderstanding and that she desperately wanted to heal our fractured family wounds. She invited me to a private family dinner at their house that evening, claiming she wanted to cook my favorite childhood meal and bridge the gap between us. It was a blatant, transparent trap. Intimidation tactics like Thomas storming my office had failed miserably. Now they were pivoting strategies attempting to lure me back into their controlled suburban environment to manipulate me behind closed doors. I knew exactly what they wanted. They needed my signature on a check to save Madeline from foreclosure, and they thought a nostalgic home-cooked meal would soften my corporate armor. I played my part perfectly. I injected just enough hesitant vulnerability into my voice to make her believe her manipulation was working. I told her I would be there. Diane gasped with manufactured delight, telling me how thrilled the whole family would be to finally have me back home where I belonged. I hung up the phone and then locked my office door. I was walking into the lion den, but I was bringing the cages. My preparation was meticulous. I did not dress for a family reunion. I dressed for a corporate execution. I selected a tailored midnight blue suit that projected absolute authority, paired with stiletto heels that echoed like gavel strikes on hardwood floors. I fastened a high-definition micro-recording device to the underside of my lapel, ensuring it was completely invisible but positioned to capture every single word spoken in that house. I placed the heavily redacted copies of the forensic financial audits into my black leather briefcase along with the undeniable proof of the fraudulent mortgage and the affair with the bank loan officer. The drive to the suburbs was a journey backward in time. As my town car navigated the winding roads leading to my parents' neighborhood, the pristine manicured lawns and towering oak trees looked exactly the same as they did the night they threw me out. The neighborhood was a fortress of upper-middle-class expectations, masking the quiet desperation of families living entirely on credit. I instructed my driver to park discreetly down the street and keep the engine running. I stepped out into the crisp evening air, clutching my briefcase like a shield. I walked up the brick pathway to the front door, feeling no nostalgia, only a cold, tactical anticipation. I pressed the doorbell and waited. Diane swung the door open almost instantly, wearing a pristine floral apron over a designer dress. She threw her arms wide open, attempting to pull me into a suffocating performative embrace. I stepped neatly to the side, allowing her arms to grasp empty air. I told her we could skip the theatrical hugs and get straight to the dinner she was so desperate to host. Diane lowered her arms, her smile tightening into a thin, furious line for a fraction of a second before the sweet mask snapped back into place. She ushered me into the grand foyer, chattering nervously about how wonderful it was to have the family back together. The house smelled of roasting herbs and expensive candle wax. It was the smell of a carefully maintained lie. I walked into the formal dining room and saw the table set with their finest crystal and imported china. Thomas stood near the head of the table holding a glass of expensive scotch. He greeted me with a booming, artificially jovial voice, acting as if he had not threatened to blackmail me with stolen psychiatric records in my office just 48 hours prior. Sitting across from him was Madeline. She wore a loose-fitting pastel maternity dress, clearly designed to emphasize a physical vulnerability. She looked at me with a mixture of smug entitlement and practiced victimhood. She offered a weak hello, claiming she was exhausted from the extreme stress of her high-risk pregnancy. She rubbed her stomach dramatically, attempting to elicit immediate sympathy. I took my seat at the opposite end of the table, placing my heavy leather briefcase on the empty chair beside me. I did not offer any comforting words or polite inquiries about her health. I knew her game perfectly. Every gesture was a calculated performance meant to weaponize her child for financial gain. She expected me to crumble under the emotional weight of her fabricated struggles and hand over my hard-earned wealth without asking a single question. We did not eat. The elaborate meal sat untouched in the center of the mahogany table. The illusion of a happy family dinner dropped within 5 minutes. Thomas cleared his throat and set his scotch glass down heavily, signaling the end of the pleasantries. He announced that they had invited a special guest to join us for dessert. Right on cue, the door to the adjacent study opened, and a man in a cheap off-the-rack suit walked into the dining room, carrying a thick stack of legal documents. Thomas introduced him as a trusted family friend and legal advisor. The lawyer took a seat next to Madeline, spreading his papers across the fine linen tablecloth. He looked at me with the arrogant confidence of a man who severely underestimated his opponent. He did not bother to introduce himself properly. Diane folded her hands on the table, leaning forward, and finally sprang the trap they had so desperately prepared for me on this cold and calculating dark autumn night. Diane began her pitch, her voice laced with artificial syrup. She folded her manicured hands and leaned across the table. "Stella," she said, "family always looks out for each other. You know Madeline is facing a temporary financial hurdle. Jamal is being financially abusive. Madeline needs stability for the new baby. We cannot let your sister end up on the street." Thomas took over with aggressive logic. "Let us be brutally honest here, Stella. You currently have no husband. You have no children. You are hoarding wealth in that glass tower, building an empire for absolutely no one. Meanwhile, your sister is building the future of this bloodline. It is your primary duty to protect the family legacy and support her." The lawyer, a man who looked like he operated out of a strip mall, finally spoke. He pushed the thick, stapled contract across the table and handed me a silver pen. "We have drafted an agreement that ensures everyone is protected," he said smoothly. "It is a simple restructuring of your assets to facilitate familial support. Sign at the bottom and we can move forward tonight." I did not touch the pen. I picked up the contract and read the first page with cold precision and calculated silence. It was a toxic piece of legal fiction. The document was structured as an irrevocable deed of gift, demanding an ongoing transfer of equity from my wealth management firm directly into a blind trust. It included a forfeiture clause that would strip me of my voting rights and hand operational control to my father. They wanted to steal my company from the inside out using Madeline to hijack my life work and personal assets. I looked at the lawyer and asked him exactly where he obtained his law degree. He blinked, his arrogant smirk faltering. "Excuse me," he asked. I dropped the contract onto the table. I pointed out that Clause 4 inherently violates Illinois corporate statutes regarding fiduciary duties. I calmly explained that attempting to coerce a majority shareholder into transferring corporate equity into an undisclosed blind trust constitutes criminal corporate sabotage. His poorly drafted contract was a textbook example of financial extortion. The lawyer opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off. "Do you actually understand who I am?" I asked, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I run a debt acquisition firm, handling multi-million-dollar portfolios. My legal team eats amateur ambulance chasers like you for breakfast. If I sign this document, I commit corporate fraud. If you present this document to me intending to execute it, you are facilitating financial fraud." His face turned a sickly shade of gray, hand on the table. "Do not speak to him like that. He is a respected professional." "High as a liability," I shot back, keeping my eyes locked on the terrified lawyer. "I give you exactly 30 seconds to pack your briefcase and walk out that front door. If you are still sitting in that chair when the time is up, I will personally forward this contract to the State Bar Association. I will include a detailed affidavit outlining your attempt to extort a corporate officer. You will lose your license to practice law before the quarter ends." The lawyer looked at Thomas, his arrogant demeanor shattering into pure, unfiltered panic. Thomas had assured him this would be an easy intimidation tactic against a vulnerable daughter. He had not signed up to be disbarred over a suburban family shakedown. He frantically grabbed the contract and shoved it into his briefcase, his hands shaking. "What are you doing?" Thomas yelled, grabbing the lawyer by the arm. "We are not finished here. Sit back down right now." "I am leaving," the lawyer stammered, yanking his arm free. "You lied to me, Thomas. You said she was just a consultant. You never told me she owned the entire firm. I cannot be part of this illegal mess." He practically sprinted out of the dining room, leaving his silver pen behind. The heavy front door slammed shut, echoing through the house. The silence that followed was deafening. The family was left completely exposed, their professional muscle having abandoned them at the first sign of real legal resistance. Diane tried to intervene, her sweet mask melting off to reveal the panic underneath. She pointed a trembling finger at me, accusing me of ruining the dinner. I ignored her entirely, keeping my focus locked on the real threat, refusing to let her emotional manipulation distract me from the true objective of the night. Thomas stood at the head of the table, breathing heavily, his face purple with absolute rage. He demanded I show some respect to my elders and hand over the funds regardless of the legal technicalities. He shouted that I was an ungrateful child who owed them absolutely everything for giving me life and providing a roof over my head. Madeline chimed in immediately, sensing the massive shift in power. Her voice dripped with fake tears as she clutched her stomach. She loudly cried that I was being heartless and profoundly selfish. She rubbed her stomach very dramatically, claiming the extreme stress I was causing was putting her unborn baby at serious risk. She sobbed that Jamal had completely abandoned her, leaving her destitute and alone. She wailed that I was her only hope for survival and that a real sister would never let her child suffer. I sat back in my chair watching her perform. The sheer audacity of her lies was breathtaking. She was sitting there actively draining her husband's bank accounts, engaging in an affair with a loan officer, and pretending to be a helpless victim. I reached into my black leather briefcase and slowly pulled out the thick manila folder containing the private investigator report. I placed it squarely on the dining table right next to the abandoned silver pen. The trap was fully sprung, and it was time to drop the first devastating bomb. I looked directly at Madeline. She was leaning heavily against the dining table, clutching her stomach with both hands. Her performance escalated the moment she saw the manila folder. She wailed louder, claiming the stress I was causing was sending her into early contractions. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a glossy ultrasound printout. She slammed it onto the table, pushing it toward me. She demanded I look at my unborn niece or nephew. She screamed that Jamal had walked out on her when she needed him most, leaving her completely destitute and terrified. She said he was a monster who refused to take responsibility for his own flesh and blood. Diane rushed to Madeline, wrapping her arms around her golden child. Diane glared at me with pure venom, stating that I was a cold and unnatural woman for refusing to help a pregnant mother in crisis. Thomas stood tall, attempting to use his physical presence to intimidate me into looking at the ultrasound. He ordered me to pick up the photo and find my humanity. He said this baby was family, and family wealth belonged to the next generation. I did not touch the ultrasound picture. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap and let them shout. I let them exhaust their manufactured outrage. When they finally ran out of breath waiting for my capitulation, the silence in the dining room became suffocating. I reached out and opened the manila folder. I pulled out a high-resolution color printout of my own and laid it right next to Madeline's ultrasound photo. I told Madeline she could drop the desperate mother routine immediately. I explained that when my firm acquires a distressed debt portfolio, we conduct rigorous due diligence on the debtors. I informed them that my security team had hired a premier private investigator to look into her sudden financial collapse. I told her the investigator dug into everything, including the public social media profiles she used to complain about her husband. I tapped my finger on the glossy printout she had provided. I told her it was a very touching image, but it had a fatal flaw. I asked Thomas to look closely at the bottom right corner of Madeline's ultrasound picture. I told him to read the serial number printed there. Then I slid my own document closer to him. I explained that my document was a screenshot taken directly from a popular medical stock photography website. I pointed out that the serial numbers matched perfectly. The shadows matched perfectly. The date stamp on the image was from 7 years ago. Madeline had not even bothered to crop out the tiny watermark from the stock image database before she printed it on high-gloss paper to extort me. Madeline's face lost all its color. She snatched the fake ultrasound off the table and shoved it back into her handbag, her hands trembling violently. She tried to stammer out an excuse, claiming she had lost the real copy and just wanted something to show the family. She was stumbling over her own lies, her voice pitching higher with every word. Diane looked confused, staring at the space where the photo had been. Thomas frowned, his brow furrowing as the reality of the forgery slowly registered in his mind. But I was not finished. I pulled another document from the folder. I told Madeline that my private investigator did not just stop at reverse image searches. I explained that Jamal had full access to their shared medical insurance portals. I looked Madeline dead in the eye and delivered the absolute truth. I told the room that Madeline was not pregnant. I stated clearly that she had a non-reversible intrauterine device implanted 3 years ago, right after the birth of her second child. I told them the medical billing records confirmed the procedure and the ongoing routine checkups. The pregnancy was a total sham, designed entirely to manipulate her husband and extort money from her estranged sister. The dining room descended into absolute chaos. Diane let out a sharp gasp, backing away from Madeline as if she were contagious. Thomas stared at his favorite daughter, his mouth hanging open in utter disbelief. He asked Madeline if it was true. Madeline began to hyperventilate, clutching the edge of the table. She screamed that Jamal had illegally accessed her records and that I was invading her privacy. She did not deny the truth because she knew she was trapped. She just spun a new web of victimhood, claiming she only faked the pregnancy because she was desperate for Jamal to stay and pay the mortgage. I sat back in my chair watching the golden child facade burn to ash. I told them this was who they had protected. This was the daughter they chose over me 15 years ago. A woman who would fake a pregnancy, forge legal documents, and steal from her own family just to maintain a country club lifestyle. Madeline pounded her fists on the mahogany wood, shrieking that I was ruining her life. She sobbed that Jamal was abandoning his children and I was cheering him on. I sharply corrected her. I told her Jamal was abandoning a toxic fraud, but he was absolutely securing custody of his kids. I explained that Jamal had already filed the emergency custody orders earlier today. I watched Madeline collapse into her chair, weeping uncontrollably as her fabricated reality shattered completely. Thomas and Diane were speechless, entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her deception. They had built their entire identity around her perfection, and now it was rotting right in front of them. The trap had closed exactly as I planned. The room was heavy with the silence of their destruction. I took a deep breath, readying myself for the next phase of the execution. I gathered my documents, knowing my work here tonight was almost finished. Everything was perfectly falling exactly into its place. The silence in the dining room was heavy, but it did not last long. Thomas was a man who operated entirely on ego and financial self-preservation. The revelation that his golden child had faked a pregnancy did not evoke any moral outrage in him. It simply meant their emotional leverage was gone. He looked at the extortion contract sitting on the table and then looked at me. His face contorted into a mask of pure, desperate rage. He snatched the thick, stapled document and shoved it across the mahogany wood until it hit my hands. He shouted that he did not care about the fake ultrasound or Madeline and her pathetic lies. He roared that I was still the billionaire chief executive officer and they were still my family. He demanded I pick up the silver pen and sign over the corporate equity immediately, or I would never leave this house. I picked up the contract. I held it up so the crystal chandelier light caught the thick, expensive paper. Then I gripped it firmly with both hands and tore it right down the middle. The sound of ripping paper echoed sharply across the room. I stacked the torn halves together and ripped them again, letting the shredded pieces fall directly onto my untouched plate of roasted chicken. I told him my wealth belonged to me and my company belonged to my shareholders. I stated clearly that his golden child was a fraud and he was nothing but a failed tyrant running out of other people to exploit. Thomas completely lost his mind. He lunged around the dining table, knocking over a crystal wine glass that shattered violently on the hardwood floor. He positioned his massive frame directly in front of the arched doorway, physically blocking my only exit. He pointed a trembling, thick finger right at my face. He yelled that I was an ungrateful, arrogant little girl who needed to be taught a permanent lesson. He stepped closer, raising his hand threateningly, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me into submission, just like he did when I was a teenager. Diane shrieked from the corner, telling him to make me pay. Madeline just watched, her eyes wide with a sick, desperate hope that her father could somehow bully me into funding her lifestyle. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at my gold wristwatch, noting the precise time. I looked back up at Thomas and offered a cold, predatory smile. I told him he was making a severe tactical error. I explained that false imprisonment and attempted assault would look terrible on his federal record. He sneered and asked what I was talking about. I told him my +1 had finally arrived for dessert. Right on cue, the heavy oak front door swung open with a massive authoritative crash that shook the walls. It was not the local police checking on a noise complaint. It was Jamal. His face was a portrait of absolute controlled fury. He was no longer the exhausted, manipulated husband. He stood tall and resolute, an orthopedic surgeon, stepping into a highly contaminated operating room, ready to cut out the infection. And he was not alone. Flanking Jamal were 4 men wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the letters IRS emblazoned across their backs in bold yellow text. They were federal agents from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. They stepped into the grand foyer, their mere presence instantly suffocating the arrogant entitlement that had previously filled the house. The heavy thud of their boots on the marble floor sounded like the ticking of a doomsday clock. Thomas stumbled backward, his face turning an unhealthy shade of chalky gray. He lowered his raised hand, instantly shrinking away from the doorway. Diane let out a sharp, terrified shriek, clutching her pearl necklace as if the jewelry could somehow protect her from federal scrutiny. Madeline remained frozen in her dining chair, her eyes wide with absolute horror as she stared at her husband and the imposing federal agents. Jamal walked directly into the dining room, bypassing Thomas and Diane entirely. He did not yell. He did not cause a scene. His silence was entirely lethal. He stopped directly in front of Madeline. He reached into his coat pocket and dropped a thick, professionally bound legal document onto the table right next to her fake ultrasound pictures. He announced, his voice echoing with absolute finality, that she was officially served. He stated those were the divorce papers. He then dropped a second document on top of the first. He informed her he had already secured a temporary emergency restraining order from a judge, granting him full sole physical and legal custody of his children. He told her she had exactly zero right to contact him or his children ever again. Madeline opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She looked at the legal documents as if they were explosive devices. Her entire meticulously constructed reality was vaporizing before her eyes. One of the lead IRS agents stepped forward into the center of the dining room, holding up a gold badge and a stack of official paperwork. He announced in a booming voice that they were executing a federal search warrant regarding multiple counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. He instructed Thomas and Diane to step away from all electronic devices, mobile phones, and file cabinets immediately. He warned them that any attempt to destroy documents or interfere with the investigation would result in immediate arrest for obstruction of justice. The agents did not wait for permission. They immediately fanned out across the house. One agent headed straight for Thomas and his luxurious home office, pulling out evidence boxes. Another agent began securing the laptop sitting on the kitchen counter. They moved with professional, ruthless efficiency, highlighting the absolute collapse of the parents' carefully constructed suburban facade. The house that had served as their fortress of superiority was now an active federal crime scene. Thomas tried to stammer a protest, claiming there had to be some sort of huge misunderstanding. He insisted he was a respected businessman, and this raid was completely unwarranted. The lead agent did not even look up from his clipboard. He casually informed Thomas that the bank records subpoenaed earlier that week told a very different story. Jamal turned from Madeline and faced Thomas and Diane. His expression hardened into a mask of pure disgust. He revealed the final devastating piece of the puzzle that my forensic audit had uncovered earlier that week. He told them he knew absolutely everything. He knew Madeline had not just been stealing his money to fund her own luxury lifestyle. She had been systematically funneling his income into Thomas and Diane offshore bank accounts. I exposed the brutal truth right there in the dining room. He announced that Thomas and Diane had been secretly bankrupt for years. They had been using their golden child daughter to bleed a hardworking doctor dry, just so they could maintain their pathetic country club memberships and lease their luxury vehicles. They orchestrated the entire theft, leaving the perfect family image shattered completely into a million jagged pieces. The silence that followed Jamal's declaration was absolute and suffocating. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. Then Diane let out a shrill, hysterical laugh that sounded like glass breaking. She waved her hand dismissively, her diamond rings catching the crystal chandelier light. She claimed Jamal was overreacting to a simple family loan. She said families help each other out during temporary cash flow issues, and there was no need to involve federal authorities over a simple misunderstanding between relatives. Jamal did not raise his voice. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a stack of heavily highlighted bank statements. He threw them onto the dining table where they scattered across the expensive china. He told Diane that temporary cash flow issues do not require routing numbers in the Cayman Islands. He pointed to the top document detailing a wire transfer of $40,000 straight from his surgical practice business account into a shell corporation registered under Diane's maiden name. He stated with surgical precision that they had not just borrowed money. They had systematically laundered his income to pay for their country club dues, their leased luxury SUVs, and their weekly caviar dinners. Thomas stared at the bank statements, his face draining of all color. The arrogant patriarch who had tried to physically intimidate me just 10 minutes ago was rapidly shrinking into a terrified old man. He realized the federal agents standing in his foyer had undeniable proof of his financial crimes. His survival instinct kicked in immediately, overriding any lingering loyalty to his family. Thomas spun around and pointed a trembling finger directly at Diane. He shouted that he had absolutely nothing to do with the offshore accounts. He roared that it was entirely his wife's idea to maintain their wealthy facade at all costs. He claimed Diane could not handle the social humiliation of bankruptcy, so she orchestrated the entire theft through their daughter. Diane gasped, her hand flying to her chest in mock horror. She screamed that Thomas was a pathetic coward trying to save his own skin. She shouted that he was the one who lost their fortune in terrible real estate investments 10 years ago. She revealed to the entire room that Thomas had been secretly unemployed for a decade, spending his days playing golf while pretending to be a managing partner. She shrieked that he forced her to beg Madeline for money to keep up appearances because his fragile ego could not handle being a failure in front of their wealthy neighbors. The federal agents watched the explosive meltdown with professional detachment while actively taking notes. One agent returned from the home office carrying a stack of leather-bound ledgers and several external hard drives. He informed the lead agent that they had located the secondary books hidden behind a false panel in the bookshelf. Thomas groaned and sank into a dining chair, burying his face in his hands. I knew the secondary books contained every fraudulent tax return he had filed for the past 15 years. Madeline suddenly snapped out of her paralyzed state. The realization that her parents were actively throwing each other to the federal wolves ignited a desperate panic inside her. She realized she was going to be left completely alone to face the consequences of the massive fraud she executed on their behalf. Madeline lunged across the table, grabbing Diane by the arm. She sobbed hysterically, screaming that Diane had promised they would never get caught. Madeline wailed that she only forged Jamal's signature because Diane told her it was her duty as a daughter to save the family from poverty. She screamed that her parents told her Jamal owed them his money because he was lucky to marry into their prestigious bloodline. Jamal flinched at the sheer audacity of the entitlement baked into Madeline's confession. He looked at the woman he had loved, the woman he had worked 80-hour weeks to support, and saw nothing but a parasitic stranger. He told Madeline she was a repulsive fraud. He stated that he had spent 10 years treating her family with nothing but absolute respect and generosity, while they viewed him as nothing more than a walking automated teller machine. I told her she was going to federal prison, and he would personally ensure she never saw a single dime of his money ever again. Diane tried to yank her arm away from Madeline, swatting at her own golden child like a nuisance. She hissed at Madeline, calling her a stupid, careless girl. Diane shouted that Madeline was supposed to be discreet with the transfers. She blamed Madeline for ruining everything by getting greedy and opening the secret credit cards, which ultimately triggered the forensic audit. The golden child was no longer the pride of the family. She had instantly become the scapegoat the moment their survival was threatened. I stood leaning against the archway, watching the carnage unfold with absolute icy satisfaction. They were eating each other alive. The perfect wealthy suburban family was ripping themselves to shreds over money they never even earned. 15 years ago, they told me I was the broken one. They told me I was the family embarrassment. Now they were standing in the middle of an active federal raid, screaming obscenities at each other while facing decades behind bars. It was the most beautiful, poetic justice I had ever witnessed. Jamal turned to me, his posture rigid, but his eyes clear. He gave me a single respectful nod, acknowledging that my ruthless strategy had worked perfectly. He told the room he was leaving to secure his children and finalize the divorce proceedings. He warned Thomas and Diane not to attempt to contact his hospital or his family ever again because his legal team would destroy whatever was left of their miserable lives. Jamal turned and walked out the front door, the heavy wood clicking shut behind him with resounding finality. The lead IRS agent stepped into the center of the dining room, ending the family's screaming match. He announced that the property was now officially secured by the federal government, pending the ongoing criminal investigation. He informed Thomas and Diane that all of their bank accounts, including the offshore shell companies, had been frozen by federal mandate. They currently had absolutely zero access to any liquid capital. They could not pay a lawyer. They could not buy a plane ticket. They could not even purchase a tank of gas. Madeline collapsed onto the floor, weeping into the expensive Persian rug. Diane stared blankly at all, her entire identity as a wealthy socialite disintegrating into dust. Thomas remained slumped in his chair, a broken, defeated man facing the catastrophic consequences of his own arrogance. The illusion was dead. The reality of their total financial and social annihilation had officially arrived. And I was holding the absolute final nail for their coffin right in my hands. I turned and walked out the front door, leaving them to the federal agents and their own inevitable ruin. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind me, sealing the tomb on 15 years of psychological warfare. The crisp autumn air hit my face, clearing the suffocating stench of expensive cologne and desperate lies that had filled that dining room. I did not immediately walk to my waiting town car. Instead, I paused on the pristine brick pathway, turning slowly to look back at the grand suburban estate. The massive floor-to-ceiling bay windows illuminated the dining room like a theatrical stage, presenting the final act of a grotesque tragedy. I stood in the cool shadows of the manicured oak trees, watching the chaotic self-destruction unfold with absolute cold satisfaction. Through the glass, could see the exact moment the sheer gravity of federal criminal charges crushed their remaining sanity. The polite, affluent veneer they had worn like armor for decades completely vaporized. They were trapped in a fishbowl of their own making, surrounded by armed federal agents, methodically tagging their prized possessions. Madeline was completely hysterical. She paced erratically around the shattered crystal on the floor, waving her arms in wide, frantic gestures. She pointed an accusing finger directly at Thomas and Diane, screaming with such ferocity that I could faintly hear the muffled pitch of her voice through the double-paned glass. She was blaming her parents for forcing her into the fraud, desperately trying to shield herself by throwing them directly into the line of fire. She claimed they manipulated her into forging the signature to maintain their pathetic country club facade. Thomas did not respond with fatherly protection. I watched the arrogant patriarch viciously throw Diane under the bus. He lunged toward his wife, his face contorted in a mask of furious self-preservation. He pointed at Diane, then pointed at the ledgers the agents were securing. He was clearly informing the federal investigators that his wife was the sole mastermind behind the offshore accounts and the fraudulent tax returns. I was a coward stripping away decades of marriage in 3 seconds to save his own skin. Diane reacted like a cornered animal. She slapped his hand away, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure hatred. She shrieked violently, tearing off her expensive pearl necklace and throwing it at his chest. The pearls scattered across the hardwood floor, rolling uselessly beneath the heavy tactical boots of the investigating agents. The lead agent had clearly seen enough of the domestic implosion. I watched as he gave a sharp nod to his team. 2 agents stepped forward and flanked Madeline. They grasped her arms, pulling them firmly behind her back. Madeline widened her eyes in absolute shock as the cold steel handcuffs snapped shut around her wrists. The golden child, the untouchable favorite who had coasted through life on stolen money and fabricated victimhood, was officially in federal custody. Her knees buckled, and the agents had to physically support her weight to keep her from collapsing onto the dining room floor. Thomas tried to back away, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender, but an agent stepped into his path. The arrogant businessman who had stormed into my office threatening to ruin my company was spun around and cuffed against his own dining table. Diane dropped to her knees, weeping uncontrollably into her hands, refusing to stand up until an agent forcefully pulled her to her feet and secured her wrists. I stood in the darkness, completely untouched by the toxic mess I had finally exposed. They had built their entire identity on the illusion of superiority, demanding that the world cater to their fragile egos. Now they were being marched out of their foreclosed mansion in handcuffs. Their reputations permanently annihilated, their hidden assets frozen, and their future entirely in the hands of the federal justice system. I felt no pity. I felt no lingering sorrow for the family I never truly had. I felt only the profound surgical precision of justice taking its natural course. I turned away from the bay window and walked down the pathway to my waiting town car. My driver opened the door and I slid into the plush leather back seat. I instructed him to drive back to the city. As the car pulled away from the curb, I watched the flashing red and blue lights of the arriving local police cruisers reflecting off the pristine suburban houses. The neighborhood was waking up, doors opening as wealthy neighbors stepped onto their porches to witness the spectacular downfall of Thomas and Diane. The social death they feared more than anything else was happening in real time on their front lawn. By 8 o'clock the next morning, the financial and legal shockwaves were already dominating the local news cycle. I sat in my corner office sipping a black coffee and reading the preliminary indictments forwarded by my corporate legal team. Madeline was facing 25 counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and bank fraud. Thomas and Diane were indicted on charges of money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Because the stolen funds crossed state lines into offshore accounts, the federal prosecutors were pushing for maximum mandatory sentencing. There would be no plea deals for a light sentence. The evidence was too overwhelming, and the dollar amount stolen exceeded the threshold for leniency. Jamal called me shortly before noon. His voice sounded lighter than it had in weeks. The crushing weight of deception finally lifted from his shoulders. He informed me that the emergency family court hearing had gone exactly as we planned. The judge had reviewed the evidence of criminal activities and the explicit plans to drain his assets. Jamal was granted full physical and legal custody of his children, along with a permanent protective order keeping Madeline away from his family. My legal team had successfully deployed the financial firewall, protecting his medical license and shielding his remaining legitimate assets from being seized during the federal investigation. We had surgically extracted him from the wreckage just before the building collapsed. I ended the call with Jamal and opened my corporate dashboard. I authorized the final liquidation protocol for the suburban estate. The bank owned the house, and I owned the bank. The eviction notice was officially active. They had exactly 48 hours to pack their single canvas bag. The toxic bloodline was permanently severed and my empire remained absolutely untouchable. The 48-hour countdown was a perfectly engineered psychological pressure cooker designed to strip away their remaining delusions. I dispatched my firm private security contractors to the perimeter of the Oakwood Drive estate. Their explicit instructions were to ensure Thomas, Diane, and Madeline did not smuggle out any assets. Those assets now legally belong to the federal government and my corporation. The Internal Revenue Service had frozen their bank accounts, making them entirely destitute, but I knew their deeply ingrained entitlement would convince them they still possessed the right to take whatever they wanted. My security chief sent me hourly updates. Thomas spent the first 12 hours frantically calling his country club associates begging for emergency loans. Every single call was abruptly disconnected. Nobody wanted to be associated with a man facing imminent federal indictment for money laundering and wire fraud. He was a radioactive pariah in the exact social circles he had sacrificed his own daughter to impress. Diane attempted to slip out the back door near midnight, wearing a trench coat stuffed with expensive silverware and a hidden diamond necklace. A federal agent intercepted her on the patio and coldly confiscated the stolen assets. Madeline was entirely confined to the living room, pacing erratically while awaiting her arraignment hearing. Her former loan officer lover had officially turned state witness against her to secure his own plea deal. She had absolutely no one left to manipulate. At precisely 8 o'clock on the morning of the eviction, I stepped out of my town car and onto the pristine pavement of Oakwood Drive. The crisp autumn wind whipped around my tailored wool coat as I walked up the familiar brick pathway for the absolute final time. 2 heavy-duty moving trucks authorized by my debt acquisition firm were already parked in the driveway. I bypassed the federal agent standing by the portico and walked directly up the front steps. I used the master key provided by the foreclosure courts and pushed the heavy oak door open. Thomas, Diane, and Madeline were standing in the grand foyer waiting. They looked entirely hollowed out, their faces pale and drawn from 48 hours of relentless panic. But even in their absolute ruin, their inherent arrogance flared up one last time. Sitting at their feet were 6 massive luxury Louis Vuitton suitcases stuffed to the absolute brim with designer clothing, expensive electronics, and high-end cosmetics. They fully intended to walk out of my foreclosed property carrying the spoils of their fraudulent lifestyle. I stopped at the threshold, blocking their exit. I looked at the mountain of expensive luggage and offered a cold, razor-sharp smile. I informed them they were severely misunderstanding the terms of their eviction. I pulled a crisp, legally binding document from my coat pocket and unfolded it. I read the asset seizure clause aloud, ensuring every single word echoed clearly in the empty foyer. I stated that every luxury item in this house was purchased using funds stolen from Jamal or funneled through fraudulent tax evasion schemes. Therefore, those items were officially seized by the federal government and the lien holder. They owned absolutely nothing. Thomas stepped forward, his face flushing red with a sudden burst of impotent rage. He shouted that I could not leave them with absolutely nothing on the street. He demanded to know how they were supposed to survive without their basic necessities. Diane began to sob hysterically, clutching her designer handbag against her chest, as if her life depended on it. She cried that I was a cruel, vindictive monster, and that no daughter would ever treat her own mother with such calculated malice. Madeline just stared at the floor, completely broken and silent, her golden child status officially revoked by reality. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage with their manufactured outrage. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out 3 cheap, flimsy canvas bags. They were the exact same brand, the exact same generic beige color, as the bag Diane had shoved into my hands 15 years ago when she threw me into the freezing Chicago winter. I tossed the 3 empty canvas bags onto the marble floor, right next to their confiscated Louis Vuitton luggage. The thud of the canvas hitting the stone was the loudest sound in the room. I looked directly into my mother-terrified eyes and delivered the final crushing blow. I told them they were allowed to take exactly 1 change of basic clothing and their personal identification documents. Everything else stayed inside the house. I pointed to the cheap canvas bags on the floor. I coldly informed them that they had exactly 5 minutes to transfer their permitted items before my security team physically removed them from the premises. Diane dropped to her knees, weeping uncontrollably, as she desperately dug through her luxury suitcase, pulling out a single pair of sweatpants and a plain sweater. Thomas' hands shook violently as he transferred a pair of jeans and a folded shirt into his canvas bag, his massive ego completely shattered by the sheer humiliation of the moment. Madeline moved like a ghost, silently packing her single bag without making eye contact with anyone. Her fake pregnancy belly was gone, replaced by the hollow posture of a convicted felon. When their 5 minutes were up, I stepped aside and pointed toward the sidewalk. They walked out the front door, clutching their pathetic canvas bags, their heads bowed in absolute disgrace. As they stepped off the porch and began the long, humiliating walk down the driveway toward the street, I delivered the exact cruel words they had used to destroy me 15 years ago. I called out to them, my voice ringing with cold, absolute finality. You are the strong ones. You will be fine. They did not look back. They continued walking down the street, completely stripped of their wealth, their status, and their toxic pride. I stood on the porch of the mansion I now legally owned, watching them disappear into the distance. The psychological warfare was officially over. I turned around and walked back into my property, leaving the front door wide open for the liquidation team to begin dismantling the rest of their false empire. The crisp autumn air quickly gave way to a brutal, relentless Chicago winter, mirroring the swift and merciless legal fallout that descended upon my former family. The dismantling of their false empire was merely the opening act. The real execution happened in the federal courtrooms over the next few months. Madeline was formally indicted by a federal grand jury on 25 counts. The charges read like a masterclass in financial self-destruction, including multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and bank fraud. The United States Department of Justice does not operate on suburban gossip or country club reputation. They operate on a terrifying 98% conviction rate. Madeline initially attempted to maintain her golden child arrogance during her preliminary hearings. She strutted into the federal courthouse wearing a cheap borrowed blazer, expecting her usual manipulation tactics to work on the federal prosecutor. She quickly discovered that crying in front of a federal judge yields absolutely zero sympathy. The harsh reality of her situation shattered her remaining delusions when the judge demanded her legal representation step forward. Because the Internal Revenue Service had completely frozen Thomas and Diane offshore accounts and seized all domestic assets, Madeline had absolutely zero capital. She could not afford the high-priced, aggressive defense attorney she desperately needed to navigate a white-collar criminal defense. Instead, the court assigned her a notoriously overworked public defender who had 80 other cases on his desk and absolutely no patience for her manufactured tears. I attended the arraignment hearing, sitting quietly in the back row of the gallery. I watched Madeline turn a sickly shade of white as the federal prosecutor outlined the minimum mandatory sentencing guidelines for aggravated identity theft. Federal prison time is not negotiable. There is no early parole for good behavior in the federal system. She was looking at a minimum of 10 to 15 years behind bars. Her public defender requested bail, but the prosecutor successfully argued that Madeline posed a severe flight risk given her previous attempts to access offshore accounts. The judge agreed, and Madeline was remanded into federal custody pending trial. The golden child who had spent her entire life wrapped in luxury and entitlement was stripped of her designer clothes and issued a standard orange jumpsuit. She was escorted out of the courtroom in heavy iron shackles, her wrists secured to a waist chain. The prosecution case was already a titanium fortress, but it became an absolute slaughter when David, the loan officer, decided to prioritize his own survival. David was a coward who recognized a sinking ship the moment the federal agents subpoenaed his bank records. Facing decades in federal prison for facilitating the fraudulent second mortgage and processing the stolen college funds, David immediately requested a proffer session with the federal prosecutors. He sought a plea deal and formally turned state witness against Madeline. David handed the federal investigators everything. He surrendered his personal laptop and his encrypted mobile phone, providing a massive digital footprint of their entire conspiracy. He gave them years of text messages detailing exactly how Madeline planned to drain Jamal's surgical income. He provided emails showing her explicit instructions on how to forge the signature for the mortgage documents. I even handed over the hotel receipts paid for with the stolen credit cards, proving that she used the fraudulent funds to finance their affair. David testified under oath that Madeline was the primary architect of the entire financial scheme, manipulating both him and her husband to fund her lavish lifestyle. The betrayal broke Madeline completely. She had always relied on her ability to manipulate men into doing her bidding, believing she was the smartest person in the room. Now, the very man she had engaged in an affair with to secure her stolen wealth was the exact star witness guaranteed to lock her inside a federal penitentiary. The prosecution possessed a mountain of irrefutable evidence. There was no defense strategy that could overcome the combined weight of forensic accounting, digital communication records, and a cooperating co-conspirator. During a pre-trial status conference, I watched her public defender quietly inform her that taking the case to a jury trial would be absolute suicide. He advised her that the only logical path forward was to plead guilty and hope the judge showed a fraction of leniency during the sentencing phase. Madeline sat at the defense table sobbing into her shackled hands, her shoulders shaking violently. She looked back at the gallery, desperately searching for Thomas and Diane, but they were not there. They were fighting their own catastrophic legal battles, entirely consumed by the absolute destruction of their own lives. She was completely isolated, facing the full crushing weight of the United States justice system, completely alone. I sat in the gallery, observing the wreckage with cold, absolute satisfaction. I felt no pity for the woman weeping at the defense table. She had spent 15 years gleefully profiting from my pain and discarding anyone who stood in the way of her unearned luxury. She had stolen from innocent children and attempted to destroy a good man entirely for her own vanity. The tears she shed now were not born of remorse or guilt. They were born of terror because she had finally run out of people to blame and victims to exploit. The consequences of her actions had finally arrived to collect the debt, and they were charging a catastrophic rate of interest. I stood up from the wooden bench, smoothing the lapels of my tailored suit jacket. I did not wait for the federal judge to formally bang the gavel and end the morning session. My work in this courtroom was effectively done. I walked out of the heavy double doors of the federal courthouse and stepped into the bustling, vibrant energy of the Chicago street. The cold winter wind bit sharply at my face, but it felt incredibly refreshing and pure. I had successfully audited the golden child out of existence, neutralizing the absolute greatest threat to my peace and security. Madeline was going away for a very long time, locked behind concrete and steel, and I had a highly successful multi-million-dollar corporation to run. The scales were balanced. The swift and absolute annihilation of my parents' social standing was a masterclass in the ruthless nature of the Chicago elite. Thomas and Diane had spent 3 decades meticulously cultivating an image of impenetrable wealth and prestige. They built their entire identities around exclusive dinner parties, charity galas, and the coveted membership at the Oak Ridge Country Club. But high society is a fragile ecosystem built on mutual utility. The exact second The federal indictments hit the public record. My parents transformed from esteemed socialites into highly contagious financial lepers. I did not have to actively orchestrate their social execution. The community did it for me with terrifying efficiency. My corporate intelligence team provided me with daily updates on the fallout. 2 days after the eviction, the Oak Ridge Country Club Board of Directors convened an emergency session. Thomas desperately attempted to attend the meeting. He drove a rented compact car to the heavily guarded club gates, fully intending to leverage his 30-year friendship with the board members to secure a temporary loan. He genuinely believed his past status would override his current federal criminal charges. Howe was denied entry by a 20-year-old security guard. The board had preemptively revoked his membership privileges and explicitly blacklisted him from the premises. Thomas stood at the wrought iron gates shouting through the bars at men he had golfed with just last week. Those men drove past him in their luxury vehicles, refusing to even make eye contact. The sheer indignity of being treated like a vagrant at the exact institution he used to rule completely shattered his massive ego. Howe was left standing on the curb, a completely ruined man shouting into the void, while the upper class moved on without him. Diane fared no better in her desperate attempts to salvage her shattered reality. She tried to attend her weekly bridge club luncheon hosted at a prestigious downtown restaurant. She walked into the private dining room wearing the cheap sweater she had packed in her canvas bag, expecting her lifelong friends to offer sympathy and a warm meal. Instead, the room fell entirely silent the moment she crossed the threshold. The hostess quietly approached her and handed her a pre-written letter from the group. The letter bluntly stated that her presence was no longer welcome as her family association with federal wire fraud and money laundering reflected poorly on their charitable organizations. She was escorted out of the restaurant by the manager while her former friends watched in stony silence. Their financial vacuum was absolute. The Internal Revenue Service did not just freeze their primary checking accounts. Federal agents executed a sweeping asset forfeiture protocol that targeted every single hidden financial vehicle my parents possessed. Diane had secretly maintained a private safety deposit box at a local credit union containing emergency cash and heirloom jewelry. When she arrived at the bank to empty the box, she found 2 federal agents waiting for her in the vault. They handed her a seizure warrant and confiscated the contents right in front of her eyes. She fell to her knees on the bank floor, sobbing uncontrollably, as her absolute last safety net was legally confiscated by the federal government. With absolutely zero liquid capital and a highly publicized criminal record, securing standard housing became an impossible task. No reputable landlord in the state of Illinois would sign a lease with tenants facing imminent federal prison time for massive financial fraud. Their spectacular downfall forced them to accept the only living arrangement available to individuals with completely decimated credit scores and frozen assets. They moved into a dilapidated trailer park on the industrial outskirts of the city. The contrast between their former suburban mansion and their new reality was stark and unforgiving. The trailer park was a bleak expanse of cracked concrete, rusting aluminum siding, and chain-link fences. It was a place designed for sheer survival, not luxury. For people who had dedicated their entire existence to projecting an image of flawless superiority, this environment was a customized psychological hell. My legal team required a final signature from Thomas regarding the official relinquishment of a minor corporate asset tied to the foreclosed estate. I decided to deliver the paperwork personally. I wanted to see the final destination of their manufactured arrogance. My driver navigated the sleek black sedan through the pothole-riddled streets of the trailer park, drawing the immediate attention of the residents. I stepped out of the car wearing a tailored charcoal suit, stepping carefully over a puddle of stagnant water. I walked up to a rusted aluminum door and knocked firmly. Diane opened the door. The woman standing before me was entirely unrecognizable. Her perfectly highlighted hair was dull and unkempt, showing stark gray roots. Her posture, once rigid with manufactured pride, was deeply slumped. She stared at me with hollow, exhausted eyes. The smell of cheap cooking oil and damp mildew drifted out from the cramped interior of the trailer. I stepped inside the narrow living space without asking for permission. Thomas was sitting on a stained floral sofa, staring blankly at a small, static-filled television screen. He did not even look up when I entered. The man who used to demand absolute obedience from everyone in his orbit was now entirely defeated by his own greed. I placed the legal document on the small scratched laminate table. I kept my voice strictly professional, offering absolutely zero emotional engagement. I instructed Thomas to sign the asset relinquishment form so my firm could finalize the estate liquidation. Diane wrung her hands nervously, standing awkwardly in the tiny kitchenette. She looked around the dismal trailer and then looked at my expensive suit. She whispered that the heating unit was broken and they could barely afford groceries. She begged me to show a tiny fraction of mercy and provide them with a small allowance just to survive the winter. She tried to invoke the concept of family one last time. I looked at the peeling linoleum floor and the water-stained ceiling. I turned my gaze back to Diane, offering a cold, razor-sharp smile. I reminded her that when she threw me out at 19, she did not provide a winter coat or a grocery allowance. I told her I was simply matching her exact level of maternal generosity. I informed her that her absolute obsession with status and appearances had built this customized prison, and she was going to serve her entire sentence inside it. Thomas silently picked up a cheap plastic pen and signed the document, his hand trembling violently. He did not say a single word. I retrieved the paper, turned around, and walked out of the rusted aluminum door. I stepped back into my waiting car, completely leaving them behind in the squalor they had meticulously engineered for themselves. The cycle was officially broken, and the scales were permanently balanced. The winter thaw slowly transformed Chicago, bringing a brittle but undeniable sense of renewal to the city and my own life. With my biological family permanently confined to their respective legal and financial prisons, I turned my attention to the only collateral damage worth salvaging. Jamal had executed his legal extraction with the same meticulous precision he applied in the operating room. The family court proceedings were an incredibly brutal and entirely one-sided legal slaughter. Madeline attempted to weaponize her maternal status one last time, dialing into the custody hearing from the federal detention center. She sobbed, claiming Jamal was alienating her from the children. The family court judge, a seasoned veteran who had zero tolerance for convicted fraudsters, muted her line while Jamal's attorney presented the forensic financial evidence. The evidence proved Madeline actively drained the college funds earmarked for Jamal's two children. The family court judge took precisely 15 minutes to formally issue a permanent ruling granting Jamal full physical and legal custody. He issued a protective order severing Madeline from any future contact. The divorce decree finalized, simultaneously stripping Madeline of any claim to Jamal's future surgical income or his retirement accounts. She walked away with nothing but her federal indictment. The hospital administration board review was the final hurdle. Madeline attempted a vindictive strike, sending anonymous emails to the chief of staff, falsely claiming Jamal was complicit in the fraud. She wanted to drag him down into the dirt. I did not let that happen. My corporate legal team intervened directly on Jamal's behalf, presenting the administrative board with the certified forensic audit. This proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jamal was the primary victim of severe identity theft. We showcased the forged loan documents proving Madeline acted entirely alone. The hospital board completely exonerated Jamal. He retained his medical license and his professional reputation. The firewall held perfectly. With the legal warfare officially concluded, the dynamic between Jamal and me began to fundamentally shift. We were no longer two generals coordinating tactical strikes in sterile coffee shops. He invited me to his new townhouse situated in a quiet neighborhood entirely disconnected from the toxic suburban nightmare my parents curated. I arrived on a Sunday afternoon carrying a simple housewarming gift, rather than a briefcase full of devastating legal documents. Jamal opened the door wearing a casual sweater and jeans, a stark contrast to the exhausted scrubs or rigid defensive suits he had worn during our previous encounters. The tension that had permanently bracketed his eyes for the past year was completely gone. He looked younger, healthier, and genuinely at peace. He welcomed me inside with a warm embrace that felt entirely foreign but undeniably genuine. He introduced me to his two children, Malik and Jasmine. They were bright, resilient teenagers who had been thoroughly shielded from the ugliest details of the fallout, but understood enough to know their father had fought a massive battle to protect them. I sat at their kitchen table watching a dynamic I never experienced in my own life. Jamal cooked dinner while engaging his children in active, interested conversation. He asked about their academic projects and their weekend plans, actually listening to their answers without turning the dialogue into a critique of their achievements. There was no undercurrent of conditional approval. There was no suffocating pressure to perform for appearances. He guided them with a firm but profoundly gentle hand, ensuring they felt valued simply for existing. It was a staggering contrast to the psychological warfare I endured under Thomas and Diane, where every interaction was a calculated transaction. After dinner, the kids retreated to the living room to watch a movie, leaving Jamal and me alone at the kitchen island. He poured 2 glasses of red wine and gently slid one across the countertop. He raised his glass and looked at me with deep, unwavering gratitude. He told me that I had saved his life and the future of his children. He stated that if I had not intervened and exposed the financial rot, he would have lost his medical license, his savings, and his sanity to a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a host to parasitize. I picked up my glass and met his gaze. I told him he saved himself the moment he chose to face the brutal truth instead of clinging to a comfortable lie. I explained that I only provided the ammunition, but he was the one who pulled the trigger to defend his family. We drank the wine in a comfortable shared silence. We had forged an alliance in the trenches of a bitter conflict, but we were actively building something entirely different in the peace that followed. Over the next several months, my visits to Jamal Townhouse became a regular staple of my routine. I spent Thanksgiving with them sitting around a table filled with genuine laughter instead of manufactured tension. I attended Malik High School debate tournaments and watched Jasmine perform in her regional track meets. I found myself naturally stepping into the role of a supportive aunt, a title I had previously associated only with obligation and resentment. Jamal and I developed a profound, respectful friendship rooted in mutual survival and an absolute refusal to tolerate toxic behavior. I spent my entire adult life building a multi-million-dollar empire to ensure I would never need another human being to survive. I constructed a glass tower of wealth and authority to protect the 19-year-old girl who was thrown into the snow with a single canvas bag. But sitting in Jamal's living room, surrounded by the easy warmth of a healthy, functioning household, I realized I had accidentally acquired something far more valuable than distressed debt portfolios. I had found a chosen family. I had discovered a bloodless kinship built entirely on loyalty, accountability, and mutual respect. The empire I built kept me safe, but this new alliance finally made me whole. The morning sun crested over the icy waters of Lake Michigan, casting a brilliant golden light across my 40th floor office. I stood by the massive glass windows holding a warm cup of black coffee, watching Chicago wake up below me. The brutal winter was breaking, yielding to the early promises of spring. It was a fitting transition. The storm that had raged through my life over the past 6 months was officially over. The dust had settled, the federal indictments were secured, and the toxic debris of my biological family had been permanently swept away. I felt a profound, unshakable sense of peace. For 15 years, I had built this corporate empire as a fortress to protect myself from the people who were supposed to love me. Today, it was no longer just a fortress. It was a monument to my survival. I walked over to my mahogany desk and took my seat, sinking into the plush leather chair. I opened my laptop to begin my workday, reviewing the quarterly financial projections for my wealth management firm. The numbers were exceptional. My team seamlessly integrated the distressed asset portfolios we acquired, and our profit margins were shattering previous records. The business world moved forward unbothered by the spectacular suburban collapse of Thomas and Diane. As I was finalizing a lucrative merger agreement, a new notification popped up in the corner of my screen. It was an email from an unfamiliar generic address. My corporate spam filters usually caught unauthorized external communications, but this one had somehow slipped through the cracks. I clicked on the message, and the sender name made my hand pause on the mouse. Diane. She managed to find a public-facing email address for my executive suite, probably using a public library computer, since the government seized their devices. I stared at her name for a long moment, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no anxiety, no lingering familial guilt. Just a cold clinical curiosity about what a ruined narcissist sounds like when they have entirely run out of leverage. I opened the email. The subject line read simply, "A mother pleading." The message was a masterclass in classic emotional manipulation. Diane did not start with an apology for the decades of abuse, the blatant financial fraud, or the horrific treatment she inflicted upon me and Jamal. Instead, she immediately launched into a frantic, pathetic victim narrative. She wrote that the trailer park was freezing and the cheap space heater they bought had broken down during the night. She claimed Thomas was suffering from severe chest pains due to the stress of his impending federal trial, and they had absolutely zero money to pay for his blood pressure medication. She begged me for a temporary loan of just $500. She promised they would pay me back the exact second their legal situation was resolved, a blatant lie, considering they were facing federal prison time and catastrophic restitution debts. Then came the inevitable guilt trip. She typed that she carried me for 9 months, that she endured the pain of childbirth to bring me into this world, and that a daughter has a sacred biological duty to ensure her mother does not freeze to death in a rusted aluminum box. She ended the email by saying she knew I was fundamentally a good person and she was praying for my quick response. I read the message twice, analyzing the sheer audacity of her delusion. She actually believed that invoking the biological technicality of my birth would override the fact that she threw me onto the street with a canvas bag when I was a vulnerable 19-year-old girl. She thought a cheap guilt trip would erase the memory of her plotting to steal my inheritance to fund Madeline and her fraudulent lifestyle. Toxic people never change their core programming. When their intimidation tactics fail, they simply pivot to playing the ultimate victim, hoping to exploit the very empathy they actively tried to destroy in you. I did not type out a furious reply. I did not engage in a drawn-out digital argument to explain exactly why she deserved her squalor. Silence is the most devastating weapon you can use against a narcissist who thrives on securing your emotional reaction. I moved my cursor over the trash icon. I clicked delete. I opened my administrative settings and permanently blocked the email domain, ensuring she could never bypass my security filters again. Just like that, she was gone, erased from my digital ecosystem as thoroughly as she was erased from my actual life. I closed my laptop and stood up from my desk. I walked back over to the towering glass windows, looking out at the sprawling, infinite possibilities of the city below. I felt an incredible surge of pure, unfiltered empowerment. I slowly turned away from the skyline and looked directly into the camera, addressing every person out there who is fighting their own quiet battles. Family is not defined by the random genetic lottery of your birth. Blood does not give anyone a free pass to drain your bank accounts, destroy your mental health, or sabotage your future. If the people who share your last name treat you like a disposable asset, you have the absolute right to bankrupt their access to your life. Cutting off a toxic bloodline is not an act of cruelty. It is a necessary act of basic self-preservation. You are allowed to protect your peace with the same ruthless efficiency you use to protect your physical safety. You deserve a life surrounded by people who celebrate your strength instead of exploiting your vulnerabilities. Have you ever had to permanently walk away from toxic relatives to save yourself? Please share your own personal stories in the comments section below. Hit like and subscribe to the channel if you believe in reclaiming your power. Always remember, you are the strong one and you will be fine. The story of Stella's triumph over her manipulative relatives highlights a profound and often painful truth-sharing. DNA does not automatically entitle someone to a place in your life. Society frequently conditions us to believe that family bonds are unbreakable and that we must endlessly forgive those who share our bloodline. However, this narrative can become a dangerous trap when dealing with individuals who use guilt manipulation and status to exploit our empathy. Stella's journey from a discarded teenager to a fiercely independent CEO teaches us that true security comes from within, not from appeasing toxic relatives. When her parents and sister repeatedly chose greed over genuine love, Stella realized that her survival depended on establishing insurmountable boundaries. She learned that walking away from abuse is never an act of cruelty, it is the ultimate act of self-preservation. This narrative reminds us that we are not obligated to set ourselves on fire just to keep our relatives warm. A healthy family dynamic is built on accountability, mutual respect, and unconditional support. When those fundamental elements are replaced by financial exploitation and emotional blackmail, we have every right to audit our relationships and permanently sever ties with the architects of our pain. Healing truly begins the moment we stop seeking validation from those entirely incapable of providing it. Take a moment today to evaluate the boundaries in your own relationships and never hesitate to distance yourself from anyone who drains your peace.